They say history remembers the conquerors, the kings, the men who carved their names into stone with fire and steel. But sometimes, the real stories hide in the shadows just behind them, stories carved not into stone, but into bone. And when those bones are finally unearthed, when the earth itself forces us to listen, we begin to realize that the past we think we know is only a thin shell. Beneath it lies a truth far older, far darker, and far more human than the sagas ever dared to admit. This is the part of Viking history almost no one tells. The part that lived not in the halls of warriors or the poetry of skalds, but in the silent suffering of the women taken across oceans, treated as trophies, traded like cattle, and bound by laws that saw their bodies as nothing more than property claims. It begins with the sound of a longship's oars slicing through cold northern water, but it ends with secrets buried under centuries of soil, secrets that are only now beginning to whisper again. Imagine the early morning fog rising over a coastal village. You hear nothing at first. Just the wind. Just the gulls. But then faintly the rhythm begins, the steady thump of wood and muscle, the breathing of men who have rowed all night. By the time anyone sees the carved dragon heads pushing through the mist, it is already too late. Archaeologists found entire layers of burned earth along these old coasts, silent witnesses to raids that happened so suddenly most people never even reached their doors. And when the flames cooled, the same pattern repeated itself, the bodies of men and boys, and the absence of women. Those women were not forgotten because they died. They were forgotten because they were taken. What the sagas hinted at in half-sentences and euphemisms, the earth has now made clear. Runic receipts, actual carved records, show that Viking captains logged captured women as inventory. Maritime analysis of certain longships shows that some vessels were constructed with wider lower decks, not for cargo, not for livestock, but for human transport. For a market that stretched from Dublin in the west to Baghdad in the east. A market that made some Viking families richer than war ever could. And yet, the most unsettling part isn't the trade itself. It's the precision, the system, the cold, organized structure behind it. Norse law, preserved on weathered birch bark and later copied by medieval scribes, did not simply allow the taking of captive women. It codified it. It turned forced marriage into a recognized property claim. If a woman resisted, the law did not see desperation. It saw theft. The crime was that she tried to escape ownership. Some laws even ruled that a woman who attempted suicide was damaging her owner's property. The mindset was not chaos. It was bureaucracy. You can almost picture the dim interior of a chieftain's hall, firelight flickering on shields and furs, as disputes were settled. A man could argue that another stole his cattle. Or he could argue that another stole the woman he had already taken by force. Both complaints were treated almost the same. To the law, a life was simply another asset. But the story deepens when the soil speaks. When archaeologists unearthed mass graves across the Scandinavia-Baltic world, they found something chilling beyond the bones of battle. They found graves filled almost entirely with women, women who bore signs of long captivity, overwork, malnutrition, and in some cases injuries that had healed and broken again many times. None of the sagas mention these pits. Why would they? History is written by those who survive. In some places, researchers found the remains of buildings with narrow reinforced rooms, structures that did not match typical Viking farms or workshops. Some scholars, after comparing them to similar facilities in other ancient societies, concluded they served a singular purpose, containing women who were kept specifically for childbearing. When the sagas speak of thralls multiplied among the households, they use the softest words possible. The archaeology uses none. And yet, this horror was not simply the act of raiders far from home. That might have made it easier to blame on the brutality of war. What the evidence reveals instead is far more unsettling. It entered daily life. Families inherited captive women in wills. Children grew up understanding that some people in their home were not family, but property. And when danger threatened, the unthinkable happened. In one excavation, the remains of women were found in a hastily dug pit outside a burned settlement. The settlement had been attacked, likely by rival Norse. But these women had not been captured. They had been killed. Killed by the very people they lived with. Some scholars believe these mass killings were acts of despair, families choosing to execute the women they owned rather than see them carried away by an enemy who would repeat the cycle. The sagas speak proudly of defending honor. The soil shows what that actually meant. And it didn't end with the Vikings. When their descendants, the Normans, swept across northern lands, they carried the same chilling logic with them. The world praises their castles, their kingdoms, their chivalric codes, but behind the stone walls lies another truth. Norman conquerors used forced unions as a strategy of colonization, binding local women into marriages that seized land, erased families, and reshaped entire cultures. A human strategy for territorial conquest. A quieter form of warfare, but far more permanent. Before we go deeper into this hidden world, take a moment. If you're someone who wants lost history revealed, if you want the past stripped of the myths that soften it, subscribe to this channel. It helps more forgotten truths reach the people willing to face them. Because there is still more to uncover. The most haunting part of this story emerges not from dramatic sagas or battlefield relics, but from the tiny things. A fragment of jewelry shaped by trembling hands. A tool worn down by fingers that worked without rest. A child's bone showing mixed ancestry, proof not of peaceful union, but of captivity passed to the next generation. In one site, the remains of a young girl were found with a simple iron ring around her ankle. Light enough not to hinder movement. Heavy enough to remind her she was not free. Even trade hubs once celebrated for their riches, like Dublin, have revealed a darker layer beneath the merchant houses. Pits filled with bones that show patterns of exhaustion, malnutrition, healed fractures, and repetitive strain. These were not citizens. These were the invisible workforce, the captives sold to families who needed labor, companionship, or children. Some historians once argued this system could not have been as large as it now appears. But the shipping records, the architecture, the DNA evidence, the trade routes, they all point to the same truth. The Norse created one of the most efficient human trafficking networks of the medieval world. Not because they were uniquely cruel, but because they were uniquely organized. To them, the sea was not a barrier but a highway. And they used it. There is a moment in every excavation when an archaeologist must pause, must remember that the bones in the dirt were once a living person with fears, hopes, and a voice. And in Viking dig sites across Europe, that moment strikes hardest when the team realizes the pattern. The consistent age range of the women, the isolation of their graves, the absence of personal objects that would normally accompany a freeborn burial. It paints a picture the sagas never intended future generations to see. But history doesn't care about intentions. It cares about truth. Even the runes, carved by the very hands of those who lived this life, sometimes betray a quiet acknowledgement of suffering. One rare inscription found on a broken piece of wood appears to record a transaction, but at the bottom, carved faintly, someone added a single word, Scuggy Shadow. Scholars debate its meaning. Was it a nickname? A warning? A protest? Or simply the only word someone dared to write in a world that did not listen? As centuries passed, the brutality faded from memory, softened by heroic tales of raids and exploration. The Vikings became legends, their rough edges polished for audiences who preferred adventure over reality. But the earth did not forget. Every time a new grave is opened, every time the soil yields another clue, another missing piece slides into place. And the picture that forms is not one of monsters, but of humans, humans capable of greatness and cruelty at the same time. A society built on honor and glory, yet also sustained by ownership and suffering. A people who explored the world, but carried chains with them. If you've stayed with me this far, you're clearly the kind of listener who values the hidden layers of history. So let me invite you once more. Subscribe if you want more stories like this, stories that reveal what textbooks leave out. Because when we strip away the myths, what remains is not just darkness. It is understanding. Understanding that the past was complex, filled with choices that shaped our world in ways we still feel today. Entire populations today descend from those unions, those captivities, those silent tragedies. Entire regions were transformed by the mixing of peoples, some willing, many not. It forces us to ask, how many stories from the Viking Age were never told because the people who lived them were not allowed to speak? How many histories are built on silence rather than truth? And perhaps more importantly, what will future generations uncover about us? For now, all we can do is continue digging, into the earth, into the past, into the stories that have waited so long to be heard. The bones will keep speaking. The runes will keep whispering. And the forgotten women of the Viking world, carried across oceans and centuries, will finally have their place in history, not as shadows on the margins, but as the central truth that reshapes everything we thought we knew. Thank you for listening. And remember, the past is never as simple as the legends. Sometimes the real story sleeps in the dark, waiting for someone brave enough to bring it into the light.